He hasn't eaten in 11 days, the assistant whispered as the billionaire CEO stared at another untouched $400 dinner beneath the dim gold lights of a Manhattan restaurant. Ever since his mother died, Adrian Whitmore couldn't keep a single bite down. Doctors failed. Therapists failed. Then a young black waitress named Zariah quietly watched him freeze at the smell of the soup and suddenly walked into the kitchen without permission. Minutes later, a different aroma filled the room. Adrian lifted one spoonful, and his hand started shaking. Tears rolled down his face as he whispered, "That's my mother's recipe. How do you know this?" If grief had a taste, Adrian Whitmore once said quietly to his assistant, it would taste like cold food. The words barely rose above a whisper, but inside Le Claremont, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants overlooking Central Park, they landed heavier than the clink of crystal glasses or the soft hum of piano drifting through the gold-lit dining room. 11 days. That was how long the billionaire CEO had gone without finishing a real meal. 11 days since Evelyn Whitmore, the woman who built him before he built his empire, had been lowered into the ground beneath gray November skies. Since then, every chef had failed him. Michelin stars meant nothing. Imported truffles meant nothing. Private nutritionists flew in from Los Angeles and Miami offering handcrafted meals served on plates worth more than most people's monthly rent, but every dish ended the same way. Untouched. Cold. Forgotten beneath dim candlelight. Tonight was no different. A bowl of lobster bisque sat in front of Adrian untouched, steam slowly fading into the silence hanging over table 12. Around him, wealthy investors pretended not to stare. Wall Street executives lowered their voices. Even the waitstaff moved carefully, like one wrong sound might shatter the fragile tension surrounding the most powerful man in the room. Adrian sat motionless in a charcoal suit perfectly tailored to his 6'3" frame, but grief had hollowed him out in ways money couldn't hide. His eyes were darker now, tired, the kind of tired sleep can't fix. His silver watch gleamed beneath the chandelier, but his hands trembled slightly as he stared at the spoon beside the bowl. Daniel Reeves, his longtime assistant, leaned closer and spoke softly. "Sir, you should try to eat something." Adrian didn't answer. He just kept staring at the soup like it had personally betrayed him. Across the dining room, Zariah Bennett noticed everything. She always did. 26 years old, calm-eyed, and carrying herself with the quiet dignity life teaches people who have spent years being overlooked. Zariah moved through the restaurant balancing trays of wine and polished plates while invisible conversations floated around her. Rich men discussing mergers. Influencers taking photos of desserts they wouldn't finish. Couples pretending happiness beneath candlelight. But table 12 felt different. Heavy. Sad. Like the air itself was grieving. Zariah slowed as she passed Adrian's table. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough to hear him murmur under his breath, almost to himself. "It doesn't smell like hers." The sentence stopped her cold. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Like a child lost in a crowd. Marcus Hale, the executive chef, stormed out of the kitchen moments later, furious that another plate had been returned untouched. "That's the third dish tonight," he hissed toward the staff. "Do you know how much that caviar cost?" Nobody answered. Nobody wanted to. Marcus rubbed his temples. What does he even want? But Zariah already knew. Adrian Whitmore wasn't hungry for food. He was hungry for memory. Hungry for something money couldn't order off a menu. She glanced back toward the billionaire sitting alone beneath golden light, while an untouched bowl slowly went cold in front of him. And for the first time all night, something shifted inside her. Because grief had a smell. And somehow, she recognized it. The rain started just after 9:30, streaking against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Claremont like silver threads sliding down black glass. Outside, Manhattan glowed wet and restless beneath the November storm, taxis dragging ribbons of light through crowded streets, while somewhere far below, sirens dissolved into the cold night air. Inside the restaurant, warmth and wealth wrapped around every corner. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above tables dressed in white linen. Expensive perfume mixed with the smell of butter, garlic, and red wine. A pianist near the marble staircase played softly enough to sound almost like memory itself. But at table 12, none of it mattered. Adrian Whitmore still had not touched the soup. Daniel Reeves checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes before leaning toward him again. Your board meeting starts at 7 tomorrow morning, he said carefully. You need strength. Adrian let out a tired breath without looking up. Strength for what? He asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. In 10 years working beside him, he had seen Adrian Whitmore negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking. He had watched him dismantle competitors twice his age before lunch meetings even ended. Adrian was the kind of man financial magazines called untouchable, controlled, surgical. But grief had done what no rival company ever could. It slowed him down, hollowed him out. Daniel lowered his voice. People are beginning to notice. Adrian gave a faint smile that carried no warmth. Good, he said. Maybe then they will stop asking if I am okay. Across the dining room, Zariah polished wine glasses behind the service station while quietly watching the exchange. She knew men like Adrian usually carried themselves differently. Most wealthy executives who came into Le Claremont demanded attention without speaking. They snapped fingers, corrected waiters over tiny mistakes, laughed too loudly at expensive jokes. But Adrian sat like a man trying not to fall apart in public. There was something strangely human about it, something painful. Marcus Hale stormed through the kitchen doors again, already irritated before he even reached the dining room. Take away the bisque, he muttered sharply. And do not send another dish unless I approve it myself. One of the younger servers quickly grabbed the bowl from Adrian's table. As she lifted it, the scent drifted briefly through the air. Cream, thyme, butter. Adrian's jaw tightened instantly. His fingers curled against the tablecloth. Zariah noticed the reaction immediately. Not anger, not disgust, recognition, the kind that hurts. Adrian suddenly pushed his chair back an inch, enough to make nearby conversations stop. He rubbed his forehead slowly before whispering something so soft only Zariah, standing closest, could hear it. My mother used to add smoked paprika at the end. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. The dangerous kind. The kind filled with memories too heavy to carry out loud. Zariah froze for half a second, because suddenly she could picture it without ever seeing it. A younger Adrian sitting in some giant kitchen somewhere while a woman stirred soup on the stove. Maybe after school. Maybe after heartbreak. Maybe after losing his first deal. Mothers like that existed in every neighborhood. Rich or poor. Southern or northern. Black or white. The details changed. The love did not. Marcus waved a frustrated hand toward the kitchen staff. He sends everything back. Everything. But Zariah was no longer listening. She kept staring at Adrian Whitmore as rain tapped softly against the windows behind him and grief sat beside him like an invisible guest nobody else in the room understood. Some people cry after funerals. Adrian Whitmore stopped eating. The thought settled heavily in Zariah Bennett's chest as she carried a tray of sparkling water through the crowded dining room while rain continued sliding down the windows overlooking Central Park. Midnight was getting closer now, and Le Claremont had begun transforming into the kind of late-night luxury Manhattan was famous for. A jazz trio replaced the piano player near the staircase. Investors laughed louder after expensive bourbon. Candle flames flickered against crystal glasses and diamond watches. But Table 12 still felt frozen in another world entirely. Adrian remained seated exactly where he had been for nearly 2 hours, shoulders tense beneath his charcoal jacket, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the untouched place setting in front of him. Daniel Reeves quietly answered business calls beside him while pretending not to worry, but the strain showed around his eyes. Zariah recognized that look too. It was the face of someone watching another person disappear slowly while having no idea how to stop it. She stepped behind the service station and reached for another tray when an older dishwasher named Luis glanced toward Adrian's table and shook his head softly. Rich people think money fixes grief, he murmured. Then life teaches them otherwise. Zariah gave a faint nod, but said nothing, because grief did not care about bank accounts. She learned that at 14 years old, standing in a crowded hospital hallway while doctors explained to her mother that Grandma Rose would never make it home again. The memory returned suddenly and sharp. The smell of disinfectant. The flickering vending machine light. Her grandmother's warm hands growing colder by the hour. But more than anything, Zariah remembered the soup. Chicken stew with smoked paprika and black pepper. The meal Grandma Rose used to make whenever somebody in the family was hurting. After funerals. After breakups. After long, exhausting weeks when bills stacked too high on the kitchen counter. Food cannot solve pain, her grandmother used to say while stirring the pot slowly. But it reminds people they are still here. Soraya looked back toward Adrian again and realized something uncomfortable. Nobody at Le Claremont was treating him like a grieving son. They treated him like a difficult billionaire customer. Marcus Hale was offended by rejected dishes. The investors seemed embarrassed by his silence. Daniel treated his hunger like a scheduling problem needing management. But nobody asked the obvious question. What if Adrian Whitmore was not refusing food because he was stubborn? What if every bite simply reminded him of the one person he could never eat with again? Suddenly Marcus slammed a fresh plate onto the counter beside her. New order for table 12, he snapped. Truffle risotto with imported white truffles from Alba. If this one comes back untouched, I swear I am done trying. Soraya stared at the plate. Beautiful. Expensive. Meaningless. She could already feel what was about to happen before the dish even reached the table. 3 minutes later, she watched Adrian lift the fork halfway toward his mouth before stopping again. His hand trembled slightly. Then slowly, almost apologetically, he set the fork back down. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment like the sight physically hurt him. Around them, conversations softened. People noticed now, not because Adrian Whitmore was rich, but because loneliness that deep changes the air around a person. And standing beneath golden chandelier light with rain washing over Manhattan outside, Soraya Bennett made a decision she knew could cost her job by morning. The decision felt small at first. One step away from the service station. One glance toward the kitchen doors. One heartbeat louder than the jazz floating through Le Claremont. But sometimes the moments that change a life do not arrive with noise. They arrive quietly, disguised as instinct. Soraya Bennett set down her tray and walked straight into the kitchen. Heat wrapped around her instantly. Flames flickered beneath stainless steel pans while cooks shouted orders over the hiss of butter and steam. Marcus Hale stood at the center of it all like an exhausted orchestra conductor already losing patience. Table 16 needs the halibut now, he barked before spotting Soraya moving toward the prep station. What are you doing back here? She hesitated only briefly. I want to make something for table 12. Marcus stared at her as if she had spoken another language. Then he laughed once. Short. Sharp. Absolutely not. Around them, the kitchen continued moving fast and loud, but Soraya stayed calm. He is not rejecting the food because it tastes bad, she said softly. He is rejecting it because none of it feels familiar. Marcus rubbed his forehead in frustration. You think I do not know how grief works? He snapped. That man has turned down nearly $8,000 worth of food tonight. Because you are feeding his status, Soraya replied gently. Not his memory. The sentence landed harder than she expected. Two line cooks slowed their movements slightly, pretending not to listen. Marcus crossed his arms. And what exactly are you planning to make that my kitchen cannot? Soraya looked past him toward the shelves lined with ingredients. Carrots, celery, onion, fresh thyme, heavy cream, black pepper. Then her eyes landed on smoked paprika near the spice rack. And suddenly, she could almost hear Grandma Rose humming softly in their tiny Louisiana kitchen while rain tapped against old windows years ago. She swallowed carefully. Something simple, she said. Marcus gave a tired laugh filled with disbelief. Simple does not exist in this restaurant. But Soraya already knew that was the problem. Everything inside Le Claremont was designed to impress people. The crystal glasses, the imported seafood, the gold-rimmed plates. Even the menu descriptions sounded expensive. But grief did not care about presentation. Grief wanted warmth, familiarity. The feeling of home before life became complicated. Soraya stepped toward the prep counter slowly. Please, she said. Just let me try. Marcus studied her face for a long moment. Not arrogance. Not ambition. Something else. Conviction. Finally, he exhaled sharply and pointed a warning finger toward her. 5 minutes, he muttered. And if this goes wrong, you explain it to management yourself. Soraya nodded once and immediately began moving. Onion into the pan first. Then butter melting low and slow. Celery. Garlic. Carrots diced small enough to soften quickly. The scent rose almost instantly, warm and grounding beneath the chaos of the kitchen. One of the younger cooks paused near the stove. That smells different, he admitted quietly. Soraya kept stirring. It is supposed to. She added chicken stock next, then cream, black pepper, and finally the smoked paprika. The second the spice touched the heat, the aroma changed completely. Rich, smoky, comforting, not elegant, not flashy, human. Out in the dining room, Adrian Whitmore suddenly lifted his head slightly. Just an inch. Barely noticeable. But Daniel Reeves noticed immediately. So did Zariah when she glanced through the kitchen window and saw the billionaire staring toward the back hallway like somebody had just whispered his childhood into the air. The smell reached him before the bowl ever did. Warm butter, smoked paprika, black pepper blooming softly through cream and broth. Not the polished scent of luxury dining designed for magazine covers, but something older, softer. The kind of aroma that belonged in kitchens with scratched wooden tables and family photos taped to refrigerators. Adrian Whitmore sat perfectly still as the scent drifted through Lou Claremont, cutting through the expensive perfume and candle smoke surrounding him. His chest tightened instantly. Somewhere deep inside him, buried beneath 11 days of silence and grief, something moved. Daniel Reeves noticed the change first. "Adrian?" he asked quietly. But Adrian did not answer. His eyes stayed fixed toward the kitchen hallway while the jazz trio continued playing softly beneath the low golden lights. Around them, conversations blurred into meaningless noise. The city outside kept moving. Rain sliding down glass. Taxis passing below. Wealthy strangers laughing over bourbon and market forecasts. But suddenly none of it felt real anymore. Because for one impossible second, Adrian could almost hear his mother's voice again. "Do not rush the onions," Evelyn Whitmore used to say while stirring soup late at night in their Connecticut home years before private jets and billion-dollar headlines changed everything. If you rush onions, they lose their sweetness. The memory arrived so vividly it nearly stole the air from his lungs. He saw her standing barefoot in the kitchen wearing one of his father's old sweaters, steam rising around her while autumn rain tapped gently against the windows. Adrian had been 16 then, angry about school, angry about pressure, angry about becoming the son everyone expected him to become. And somehow Evelyn always knew exactly when to make soup. Not because it solved anything, because it reminded him he was loved while life felt hard. Back in the present, Adrian slowly closed his eyes as emotion tightened across his face. Daniel leaned forward carefully. "Should I call someone?" Adrian shook his head once. Barely. Across the dining room, Zariah Bennett stepped out of the kitchen carrying a simple white bowl with both hands. No gold garnish. No imported truffles shaved across the top. Just soup. Steam curled upward beneath chandelier light as she walked carefully toward table 12. Every step felt louder than the jazz. Marcus Hale watched nervously from the kitchen entrance, already expecting disaster. Other servers exchanged confused looks. One investor near the bar whispered, "What is she doing?" But Zariah kept walking calmly until she reached Adrian's table. Then she gently placed the bowl in front of him without speaking. Adrian stared at it. His throat tightened instantly. Small orange oil droplets floated near the surface exactly the way his mother used to make it. Tiny pieces of celery, fresh cracked pepper, the faint smoky color from paprika blooming through cream. Even the smell felt dangerously familiar. For several seconds, he could not move at all. Zariah stood quietly beside the table, hands folded in front of her apron, saying nothing because grief did not need performance. It needed space. Finally, Adrian looked up at her, confusion and pain colliding behind tired blue eyes. "What is this?" he asked softly. Zariah met his gaze calmly. "Something warm," she replied. The simplicity of the answer nearly broke him. Around them, Le Claremont had gone strangely quiet. Even the jazz trio seemed softer now. Adrian reached for the spoon slowly, fingers trembling slightly beneath the chandelier light, while the entire room unknowingly held its breath. The spoon shook slightly in Adrian Whitmore's hand as he lowered it into the soup. The movement was small, almost invisible beneath the chandelier light, but Zariah Bennett noticed it immediately. So did Daniel Reeves. Across the dining room, even Marcus Hale stopped pretending to organize plates and stared toward table 12 with guarded disbelief. Nobody spoke. The rain outside softened into a low whisper against the windows while the scent of smoked paprika drifted gently through the air between them. Adrian lifted the spoon slowly toward his mouth. For a second, it looked like he might stop again the way he had stopped every other time that night. Every other night for 11 days. But then finally, carefully, he tasted it. Silence. Real silence. The kind that arrives when a room senses something sacred without understanding why. Adrian froze. Completely. His eyes closed before he could stop them. And suddenly he was not sitting inside one of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants anymore. He was 8 years old again, standing barefoot in his family kitchen on a cold winter morning while snow pressed softly against the windows outside. Evelyn Whitmore stood beside the stove, humming under her breath in a cream-colored sweater with flour dusted across one sleeve. "Sit down before your soup gets cold," she teased while setting a bowl in front of him. Back then, Adrian used to hate mornings. He hated school uniforms, hated piano lessons, hated the pressure already forming around his last name. But soup nights were different. Soup nights meant his mother stayed in the kitchen longer. It meant warmth, safety, home. The memory hit him so hard his breathing faltered. Back inside Le Claremont, Adrian slowly lowered the spoon and stared down into the bowl as emotion cracked silently across his face. Daniel leaned forward in concern. "Adrian." But Adrian barely heard him. Another spoonful followed. Then another. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just a grieving son slowly remembering what it felt like to stay alive. Zariah stood quietly beside the table, hands folded gently in front of her apron, while her own chest tightened unexpectedly. She had seen sadness before, seen loneliness, seen people carry pain so heavy it changed the way they walked through rooms. But there was something different about watching a man the entire world called powerful suddenly look fragile enough to break beneath the memory of his mother's cooking. Adrian swallowed carefully before finally looking up at her again. His blue eyes glistened beneath the warm restaurant lights. "How?" he whispered. The single word carried confusion, grief, and disbelief all at once. "How does this taste exactly like hers?" Zariah hesitated softly before answering. "Because people who cook with love usually leave the same fingerprints behind." Adrian stared at her as if the sentence reached somewhere deeper than the soup itself. Around them, conversations had nearly stopped completely now. A woman near the bar discreetly lowered her wine glass. One of the younger servers wiped tears from beneath her eyes before turning away quickly. Even Marcus Hale looked shaken, though he would never admit it aloud. Adrian glanced back down at the bowl and let out the first genuine breath he had taken all night. Not a businessman's breath, not a billionaire's breath, just a tired son finally letting grief loosen its grip for one impossible moment. Then quietly, almost afraid to ask, he looked back at Zariah Bennett and said, "Would you sit down for a minute?" The question stunned the entire room more than the untouched meals ever had. A billionaire asking a waitress to sit with him inside Le Claremont was not something people saw every day. Daniel Reeves blinked once in surprise. Marcus Hale nearly dropped the towel in his hand. Nearby diners tried not to stare and failed completely. But Adrian Whitmore kept his eyes fixed on Zariah Bennett with a quiet seriousness that left no room for misunderstanding. "Just for a minute," he added softly. Zariah hesitated. Years working in restaurants had taught her invisible rules people never said out loud. Serve the wealthy. Smile politely. Never cross the line separating staff from guests. Especially guests powerful enough to make one phone call and change someone's life forever. But something about Adrian no longer felt intimidating. He looked exhausted. Human. Like a man who had spent too many nights alone with memories too heavy to carry by himself. Slowly, carefully, Zariah sat across from him while the city lights shimmered beyond the rain-streaked windows behind them. For a moment, neither spoke. Adrian glanced down at the nearly half-empty bowl in front of him, almost like he could not believe it himself. Then he let out a faint breath that sounded dangerously close to relief. "This is the first thing I have finished since the funeral," he admitted quietly. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately, giving the moment privacy without leaving the table completely. Zariah folded her hands gently in her lap. "Your mother must have loved cooking for you," she said. Adrian smiled faintly for the first time all night, though sadness still lived inside it. "She loved taking care of people," he replied, even when nobody asked her to. His gaze drifted toward the rain outside. "When I was building my company, I used to work until 3 or 4 in the morning. Every time I came home, there was soup waiting on the stove." He gave a soft laugh under his breath. "I never thanked her enough for that." The confession hung quietly between them. Honest. Unprotected. Across the restaurant, silverware clinked softly again as conversation slowly returned, but table 12 still felt wrapped in its own fragile world. Zariah looked down at the bowl. My grandmother used to do the same thing, she said. Adrian looked back at her immediately. Really? She nodded once. Whenever life got hard, she cooked. Did not matter if we were sad or broke or exhausted. She believed warm food reminded people they still belonged somewhere. Adrian stared at her for a long moment, and suddenly the differences between them felt smaller than the grief sitting quietly at the table. Different neighborhoods, different lives, different worlds entirely, but loss sounded the same in every language. What was her name? Adrian asked softly. Rose Bennett, Zariah answered. She raised me in Louisiana. Adrian smiled faintly again. Evelyn Whitmore, he said. Connecticut. For the first time all evening, the tension around his shoulders eased slightly. Not gone. Grief like that never disappeared so easily, but softened, like ice beginning to thaw around the edges. Then Adrian looked back down at the bowl again before asking the question that had been sitting behind his eyes since the first spoonful. How did you know what to make? Zariah thought carefully before answering, because some truths deserve gentleness. Because grieving people do not always need answers, she said quietly. Sometimes they just need something that feels like home. Adrian lowered his gaze again, emotion tightening silently across his face while rain continued tapping softly against the windows of Manhattan far below. For a while, neither of them noticed the restaurant anymore. The investors, the jazz music, the low glow of Manhattan beyond the windows. All of it faded into the background while Adrian Whitmore sat quietly, across from Zariah Bennett with an empty bowl in front of him for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. The sight alone felt almost unreal. Daniel Reeves checked the bowl twice like he needed visual proof. Marcus Hale stood frozen near the kitchen in trance with disbelief written all over his face. But Adrian barely noticed any of them. His attention stayed fixed on the woman sitting across from him, like she had somehow reached a part of him nobody else could find. My mother used to say something similar, he admitted softly after a long silence. About food. Zariah tilted her head slightly. Adrian looked down at the spoon resting beside the bowl. She said people could hear love in someone's cooking even before the first bite. His voice weakened briefly on the last word. Grief still lived there. Heavy. Permanent. But now something else existed beside it too. Warmth. Zariah smiled gently. Sounds like she was right. Adrian nodded faintly before staring toward the rain-covered windows again. The house feels too quiet now, he confessed. I keep thinking I will hear her in the kitchen every morning. He let out a breath through his nose. Then I remember. The honesty of it settled deeply between them. Wealth had disappeared completely from the conversation. No billion-dollar company. No headlines. No power. Just a son trying to survive the silence left behind by someone he loved. Zariah lowered her eyes briefly, understanding more than he realized. After my grandmother passed, she said carefully, I stopped cooking for almost 6 months. Adrian looked back at her immediately. Why? Because every recipe reminded me she was gone. Her voice stayed calm, but memory softened it. Then one night, I made her soup again by accident. Same smoked paprika. Same black pepper. Same cracked wooden spoon she used every Sunday. She smiled faintly to herself, and for the first time, it stopped hurting quite so much. Adrian listened closely, not like a billionaire listening to staff, but like someone desperate to understand how another human being survived the same storm. What changed? He asked quietly. Zariah thought for a moment before answering. I realize grief is strange, she said. At first, memories feel sharp enough to cut you open. But eventually, they become places you visit instead of places you drown. Adrian stared at her in silence after that. The sentence landed somewhere deep inside him. Across the dining room, people slowly returned to their own conversations again, but table 12 still carried a softness nobody could explain. Even the rain outside had eased into a gentle mist across the city. Finally, Adrian glanced down at the empty bowl once more and shook his head slightly in disbelief. Do you know what the strange part is? He asked. Zariah waited quietly. Adrian smiled sadly. For 11 days people kept trying to feed me expensive food. His eyes lifted toward hers again. But tonight, you fed me peace. The words caught Zariah off guard more than she expected, because sometimes kindness feels small while you are giving it away. A bowl of soup, a few quiet words, 5 stolen minutes at the end of a long shift. But sitting beneath the golden lights of Le Claremont, While Manhattan shimmered beyond the windows, Zariah Bennett suddenly realized something important. Healing rarely arrives loudly. Sometimes it enters a room quietly carrying steam in a white ceramic bowl.